Welcome all. My name is John Bird, and I am representing the Office of Strategic Engagement here at JSOU. Today we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker including audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or US-SOCOM. If you have any questions after this session, please email thinkjsou@jsou.us as indicated on the slide.
Hi everyone, I am Dr. Karla Mastracchio. I'm senior faculty here at Joint Special Operations University, and welcome to Think JSOU. So I am going to introduce our wonderful speaker right now, and then we're just gonna get to it with question and answers. So, and of course, if you have any questions, please send them to the text box and then I can read them and go ahead and ask them to our speaker. So let's get started. Welcome, Maggie. Maggie Feldman-Piltch builds and implements creative solutions to strengthen national and international security institutions. She is passionate about international innovation, multilateral cooperation, institutional readiness, and America. Maggie's career spans the private sector, NGOs, and academia. She founded Natsec Girl Squad, a professional development ecosystem of more than 40,000 people focused on competent diversity in national security and defense. During her 6-year tenure as Chief Executive Officer, she built a fully functional, secure community app and executed more than 2,000 events and trainings, including the multi-day annual NSGS Con. Her work fundamentally has shifted the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging conversation in the defense, federal law enforcement, and intelligence communities, and Natsec Girl Squad continues to thrive. Her career also includes time at the American Security Project, where she designed, built, and led the Women in Security program, Business Council for American Security, and ASP's US-Cuba Relations program, including a Track 2 dialogue to Havana and tenures as Risk Cooperative and the Conference Board. Maggie also has served a 1-year appointment as Junior Centennial Fellow in support of General Wesley Clark on his research on Russian national security institutions. She is a principal participant and frequent guest lecturer and podcast participant. She is the co-chair of the Leadership Council of Women in National Security Initiatives Committee and an instructor at Naval Postgraduate School Institute for Security Governance. She is the vice president of Operation Eagle Foundation, an organization that has evacuated over 100 high-risk Afghan military families and continues to support their resettlement in the Phoenix, Arizona area and mentor through the Spookstock Foundation. Maggie is an exceedingly proud graduate of Wesleyan University and Georgetown School of Foreign Service Security Studies program, and also an accomplished opera singer. So welcome, Maggie.
Thank you so much for having me, Karla. It's been a long time coming. I think this is the longest ever scheduled webinar I've done. So I hope it leads up to, it lives up to expectations.
Well, I am so glad that you're able to join us. So I have about 12 questions that I prepared, and we also have some questions from the audience, I'm sure. So, all right. So I would love for us to start by you telling us a little bit about Natsec Girl Squad, talk about its history and how you built it, why it exists, and what essentially is the impact of having an organization like this in the Natsec space.
Sure. So Natsec Girl Squad is about 7 years old now, and it started out by accident. It started out as a Google group listserv, and that listserv still exists. It's aptly named open source because it is in fact that. And it started by accident because at the time I was serving as the chief of staff to about 115 retired 3 and 4 stars, which was probably some of the most fun I've ever had professionally, and learned a lot and got to have parts of my brain and a little bit of everything. But they were all men over the age of 70 who all had a pretty similar path, right? A pretty similar glide path. They all either went to an academy or joined the military around 18. And I was in my early 20s and a woman and not in the military. And they provided some incredible professional development opportunities, a lot of mentorship, a lot of sponsorship, but our existence were kind of fundamentally different, right? And there were a lot of questions that they couldn't answer for me, and couldn't really, they didn't know, you know, what made sense kind of next for me because I wasn't in the military. And so I reached out to a number of really wonderful nonprofit organizations that were really kind of focused on women in foreign policy, women in diplomacy, women in development, or in women, peace and security, which are all incredibly important, but not my bag at all. And anyone who knows me knows that it's not my bag. It's not the right fit for me. So I reached out to a number of those nonprofits and said like, hey, this isn't quite right for me. I'm not in the military and I don't want to be in academia, but I'm not sure what I do want. Do you have any suggestions of organizations I could reach out to learn more, to meet other women? And over a few months, I reached out to a few hundred women. And every single one of them said, I haven't the slightest idea, but if you find something, please let me know because I am also looking. And so those women became the first kind of 200 members of the Natsec Girl Squad listserv. So that was about 7 years ago, maybe 8, and it's grown quite a bit since then. So as I mentioned, the listserv still exists, but it has grown into an incredibly vibrant community that includes more than 40,000 people all over the world, many of whom are US tied. So they're either, you know, military, IC, federal law enforcement, maybe they're stationed elsewhere, but we do have some Five Eyes participants as well. Most are in the national security, defense, and IC space, a little bit of diplomacy too. And the goal of the organization is really whatever the goal of the members is. So it's really about how do you define success for yourself? How do you chart that out? And get there, and then acknowledge that over time that definition is going to change, and it should change, right? What you want at 22 is different than 32 and 62. And so how do you make it easier for yourself and for others, right? We shouldn't keep failing the same way every time. You should get to fail new ways. And that's ultimately what it's about, right? It's about how do you build infrastructure that works to really focus on competent diversity, right? And both of those words are important.
Absolutely. Well, thanks. And we're going to touch on words in a second. I would love to kind of piggyback off of that and talk about defining our terms for a second. So we're going to talk about, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion, a competent diversity, capacity building, institutional readiness. Can you kind of go over for our audience today and for anyone who's going to be looking at this on YouTube later, because we have a great YouTube channel, but can you define what we're talking about here? When we talk about capacity building, when we talk about institutional readiness, what is that? What does it look like?
Great questions. And let's start with those two, and then you can jump in and tell me which one to do next, because one of my strengths is not the ability to remember exactly what order you said them to me in. So let's start with capacity building. And it's sort of my favorite thing. I mean, as you read in my very nice bio, I'm really passionate about America, and people think that's a joke. It's not. I'd say like 87% of my personality is how much I love America. Maybe more than that, really depends on the day. But to me, what I can do to best serve my country and like really be out there about how much I love America is I'm really, really good at building systems. I'm really good at looking at chaos and making order from it. I can build things where other people can't see the solution. Just please don't ask me to maintain it long term, because I get bored pretty easily. So capacity building is that first part, right? It's about how do you solve the problem you have in front of you and make sure that the next problem you have is a different one, right? How do you build a process, a system, an institution, a capability, right? How do you solve the problem you have in front of you, taking into consideration that through the fog of war, the problem's going to change, and you need to be able to pivot and be ready for that. And that's where the institutional readiness comes from, right? So capacity building is really that foundation to me. It's how I think about it, talk about it, teach about it, whatever. And institutional readiness is the pivot point. It's the often more than 2 standard deviations from where you thought you were going to be. It's how do you deal with reality when it's not the pretty picture you wrote down? And how do you make sure that your ability to respond is not at the cost, is not at an insurmountable cost or a cost you can't come back from, and doesn't play to your adversary's strengths?
I think that's really important. Because I think sometimes when you get a group of like-minded people, sometimes you lose that. You get strengths from that.
Sure.
Sometimes, you do lose that. So thank you so much for defining that. Let's talk about, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So a lot of people that I've talked to and I've moderated and DEI forums before, and I sit on some DEI committees, a lot of people get uncomfortable with those terms because they feel like that will dilute the talent pool. And I've had that said to me multiple
times.
Oh,
it must be so sad to live that way, right? I mean, and I don't mean to interrupt, but to be clear, I'm not a diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging HR professional. I'm a national security person. I just also happen to not be what everyone expects a national security professional to look like. But more than that, my brain works differently, right? I know a lot of us in this space, we all have a guilty pleasure of Dungeons and Dragons, and we try to pretend that we don't. We do. And my D&D group is all like mill friends, right? It's all Natsec people. And it also turns out that my D&D group is essentially what is the core of Operation Eagle. And we've been joking for the last 5 months that the things that made us so successful in getting our friends out and helping them resettle is Dungeons and Dragons, right? It was the best practice. And what makes D&D so much fun for us is that we're all so different. 2 of them are pilots and it's not their fault. But aside from that, we're all really different. And some of us are better at playing characters than others. Some of us just end up playing ourselves. That's me. I'm guilty of that all the time. But what made us good under pressure, what continues to make us good under pressure, is the fact that we are also different. So diversity, it's hard to define diversity without saying the word, right? Which is lazy, but it's difference. It's a lack of homogeneity. It has nothing to do with it. Like, you can have a bunch of white women is not a diverse group, right? Diverse is an adjective, or what I'm trying to say is that one of my greatest pet peeves in the world, after when people use the word quote when they mean quotation, right? To quote is a verb, quotation is a noun. When people say that they're trying to communicate with diverse candidates, that doesn't tell me anything, right? That just says that you want to talk to a group of candidates that are different from one another. Diverse is not code for Black people or brown people or women or Asians or Persians or anything, right? Diverse means different from one another. Equity is, to me, where the real work happens, because we often confuse kind of equal and same, right? And the picture that comes to mind for me is, imagine you and your friends, you're all different heights and you're trying to see over a wall. And if you all have the same step stool for the same wall height, but it doesn't take into consideration how tall you are, then you have people who don't need a step stool standing on a step stool. And you have people who need more of a step stool to see over the height, not having enough. And I think I very much understand why we're starting with kind of laying out these terms. And I think it comes from, like you said, there's a lot of fear in the national security community about these words. And I feel really sad for those people because there are much scarier things, right? Like, I lose sleep over China and the CCP. So if you're losing sleep over diversity, equity, inclusion, you're doing it wrong. And oftentimes people want to have a conversation about, well, how do you know that this makes us stronger, better, faster, smarter? And to that, I really just say two things. One is prove to me it doesn't, because I'm hyper competitive and I am interested in winning. And if you can't prove to me that it's going to hurt us, we should try. And China and the CCP is a great example. No matter what happens, the United States will always have more Black women in cyber than the CCP will. So if it's an inherent difference, why not exploit it and make it an advantage? I'm not interested in coming in second or losing. And so I just want all of the I want all the resources available to us all the time. And more people should play D&D.
No, I think that's a great answer, and they should play more D&D. I definitely agree with that. And to be fair, I'm not a DEI person either. Like, I'm a national security professional, I'm a professor, and I'm a communication consultant. That's what I want to win too. I want to win just as much as anybody else. So it's important for me as an academic, and it's important for us as an organization to have these conversations, to break down these rhetorical puzzles for people that are interested in A, solving, and B, just kind of understanding where that sits in the space and where these terms sit in the space. And I'd love to, and I have a list of questions, but I'd love to kind of touch on a couple that, when it comes to equity, right? So there's diversity and there's equity. So how is it that, we can get more people to have a seat at the table and have voices, that otherwise wouldn't be able to have them, right? So we can give them a seat at the table, but are they going to speak, right? Are we allowing? Or
are we going to hear them, right? Is what you're asking. And I think this is such a good question and a really important point, because we are all the main character in our own stories, right? And we often think that just because someone's not at our table, that they're not at a table at all, right? Yes. And that's just not true. There's a sort of older TV show. It was only on for one season. It's called Enlisted, and I'm guessing a number of us have seen it. It's great. And if anybody has any pull at Fox, please, I would love a second season of Enlisted. And this is like a perfect example of this idea of like, how do you build a table and bring people to it? And it's like, well, first of all, don't assume that there isn't a table. And how do you know that everyone else isn't talking and they're just not talking to you? So maybe it's not about them, maybe it's about you, right? What is it about your table that they're not coming to, and why aren't you hearing from them? Because that is a nightmare for institutional readiness, for morale, for command and control, right? If you think you have your finger on the pulse and you don't, you're in trouble. And that is something that I really wish our community, our space absorbed more quickly, if that makes sense, right? Because we have to really stop and look at where are we and acknowledge that, again, we're all the main character in our own stories. Like, there are rooms that I'm not in. That's just the nature of the world. And some of them I want to be in and some of them I don't. And I'm not entitled to be in every space. Nobody is. But good information should be shared. And if you're not hearing it, you're not doing your job. So that's a you problem, right?
I also want to add something too, like, don't assume, I mean, for me anyway, I think it's important to clarify, don't assume that just because you're building the table that people will be comfortable enough to speak. Mm-hmm. Don't assume that because you build the table that you're empowering other people to speak either. So I think creating those spaces where, equity is truly present and it's appreciated and there's a mutual understanding, I think are incredibly useful. So I like, we're kind of in the theoretical right now. We're kind of talking about these terms or mapping them out for our audience, which I think is super cool. As a rhetorician, totally dig that. But what I'd like to do is kind of talk about practical things that we can do. So first, I want to kind of pivot just a little bit. And, what are some of the, short-term or long-term challenges you see that impact national security? And then, if diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, all of those terms, institutional readiness, building partner capacity, all those things. If those things impact that, then awesome. If not, if you want to take this into a completely different discussion, to a completely different direction, let's go for it. But what are the short-term or long-term challenges you see that will impact Natsec?
So just brought like, what do I think are, oh, great. I mean, I would kind of divide them into two categories. Those are things that are coming from outside the house and things that are coming from inside, right? So outside the house, like CCP is always going to be top of the list for me. And I think something that straddles the line of both inside and outside the house is really kind of comes back to this. Do you have eyes on all the tables, right? Do you know where they all are? Do you know where the furniture is in your own house? Both at home and abroad. Do we actually know what's going on? Like how much are we listening and how much are we talking? And how much are we taking care of our friends? And by friends, I mean our allies and our partners. Are we present and proactive, or are we reactive? And what does that mean for less centralized terrorist networks? And I include in that incels and kind of homegrown terrorists, which for some reason we've decided like domestic extremism is somehow not terrorism. No, it is, guys. It definitely is. I'm a woman on the internet. I promise you, incels are terrorists. Happy to have that conversation another day. But I don't lose a ton of sleep. I lose a little bit of sleep over incels, but I lose more sleep over the model, right? Like how easy it is to become radicalized and have no one notice and have access to the means of production of war. I also spend a lot of time concerned about our ignorance of transnational criminal networks and how it overlays with digital currency, and thinking that digital currency is merely something that incels and terrorists use. It's not, but not using it as a mapping tool. I mean, I could go on forever. Like, you're going to get some really hyper specific things. I don't know why we don't care more about what happens 90 miles off our shore in Cuba. Why is Huawei all over the Mexico City airport? Like, really, this could be like an 8-hour webinar, just this list. And to me, how it ties into diversity, equity, and inclusion, and frankly, how I ended up becoming a person who talks about this, is because I'm a huge nerd, right? Like, I actually lose sleep over all of those things that I just listed. And most of my friends do too. And I just looked around and realized I had a lot of really smart friends who no one was hearing anything they were saying. And it made me worried that we would lose. I mean, to be overly simplistic about it, right? That's really what this is about, is like, is the idea that we're going with the one we're going with because it's the best, or it's the one that was the loudest? And why was it the loudest? I also get pretty angsty about security clearance reform. I think we have a serious insider threat risk that we don't know how to handle because we've overcomplicated it. And security clearances just take much too long. I also think we use the word innovation and don't know what it means, and just like start up little acquisition cells within each military service and somehow think that's solving the problem. Also a separate webinar.
I think we can touch on that for a second, because here's my next question. If you could single-handedly change the national security space, and I'm going to leave that as broad as you want to talk about emerging tech, if you want to talk about innovation, if you want to talk about, China, great power competition, issues with Russia, whatever you want. But if you could single-handedly change the national security space, like, what changes would you make and why? And then what would that space look like after?
There's only one. It's security clearance reform. It is so not sexy, and I'm really sorry. And I wish that it was something more kinetic, but to me, it is the most fundamental challenge, because it comes to recruiting, retention, cost, all of those things. And right now, the way that security clearance processes happen are entirely subjective. To say it's a black box would be an understatement. And it plays off of our biases, right? How many times do we see a story about somebody who has a TSSCI who was actually a Russian agent, and all of the times that he talked about how much he hated the United States military, we just chalked up to bitter soldier, right? But because we saw a white guy with a Ranger tab who married a Russian national whose father is in Putin's immediate inner circle, and we're like, that's not a problem, but I'm definitely worried about this girl whose parents came from Mexico and she was born here and her parents didn't become citizens until after. Like, I'm worried about her, but I'm not worried about the guy who's literally like at work in a skiff talking about how much he hates America and hopes Russia wins, whatever that means. But I'm going to spend my energy getting in between this undergrad who's trying to apply for an internship at the FBI. That's just lazy, right? It's lazy and it's racist. We may not acknowledge, we may not see it as racist while it's happening, but it's playing on those biases, right? We've decided that expertise looks and sounds like something very specific in this field, and everything we do is a reaction to that. And I'm not interested in simply reacting to the world around me. I'd rather shape it. And I think if you can tackle security clearance and really think about what do we mean when we say continuous monitoring? And if you're going to dox women on the internet, maybe you shouldn't, be in charge of classified information. Maybe that is a bigger problem than someone who has worked their whole young life to get a foot in the door in federal government. Like, it makes me totally bonkers. And in taking a quick look at the participants that are joining us live, there's at least one person that I know who's been sitting, waiting and waiting and waiting, making, babkas, right? Like, don't even talk to me about student loan debt. People that go into public service are not doing it for the money. So we owe them a thorough, fair, and expedient investigation. It really should not be that hard.
Right.
This is America, for God's sakes. I know it's not a sexy answer. I'm sorry.
It is though, because I feel like, where you say security clearance reform, I would say hiring practices, right? So, when I was with the Defense Intelligence Agency and I was put in charge of hiring all of our pay band twos, we went to a bunch of universities. We went to the Ivies, we went to land-grant universities, we went to small liberal arts colleges. We pretty much covered the gamut, because we hired people in history, in journalism, in fields that really weren't traditional national security fields, because we value these young people's experience. But if you look at retention rates, sometimes those aren't as high as we probably would have hoped they should be. So for me, and I think that touches off something that you said, security clearance reform, looking at hiring, but also looking at retention and acquisition. So, and in my other life is working in emerging tech and working with some startups. They have so many great things to offer, and they want to get their foot in the door with the federal government. And as many organizations are kind of stood up around the world, around the country, to be able to bring and fold those in, it's still not enough. They're still struggling to say, hey, I have something of value. I would like my country. I could be working with, Fortune 100 companies, but I want to work with the federal government because I believe in what I'm doing. I believe this could be value added, right? So I think that all kind of ties in, right? So acquisition, security clearances, hiring, even level of public trust, right? Not even at the secret or TSS.
And do we, and being mindful about what is classified and why. And the acquisition point is a great one. So Natsec Girl Squad's platform, Herd Mentality, was an AFWorks selection for Base of the Future. And there were a lot of questions from people. How are you going to onboard people safely? And I was like, well, one of our board members, helped us build a screening tool that is now used by DOJ and DHS. And everyone looked at us like we were insane, not for having the idea or building more than for building the prototype, but for saying like, we're going to do this regardless of whether DOD gets involved, right? Because we knew like doing AFWorks and being a showcase participant, great, but we knew it probably wasn't going to go anywhere, at least not in the time frame that we wanted it to, because of how these processes work. And so we just bootstrapped it and did it ourselves. And I can tell you that the developers that built out our plan built a similar version for the Naval War College for their senior leadership class when it went virtual for COVID. And the Navy doesn't ever do anything new, right? So like if you can convince the Navy to build an app in 3 months, then maybe what you did was somewhat decent. But it really scared people that we wanted to keep the community safe. I mean, any woman on the internet was like, no, that makes perfect sense. But people who didn't know they didn't know, and couldn't understand why this is something we would want to do if it wasn't about making money, right? Like they forgot the service part of all of this. And it's really interesting, right? Acquisition is still a part of service. And expediency isn't just polite, it's necessary.
No, that's a great answer. I mean, I'm sure we could piggyback off of a lot of stuff that you just said. And I think that, we could be here for literally hours talking about that. But I mean, in terms of, and I'd love to take some of the things you said and kind of unpack them and kind of bring that back to a tactical level, because a lot of people who are listening to this webinar might be like, okay, well, what does that look like in practice? And you talked about the app, and I think that's so great. But, when you're building teams, and you're starting to even get to be able to build an app or even get to the end product, right? There are certain things you have to have. So what are the must-haves in terms of, things that increase readiness and build organizational capacity? What are the things that these people can be doing now so they can get to the point where they can, build something like that?
Yeah, so I think actually I'm going to answer this through the Operation Eagle lens, just because it is a little bit more tactical and the examples are quite fresh of mind for me. So I want to be clear that this was it is a group of friends, and we happen to be a diverse bunch, but it really lends itself as a strong example. So you need, when you are moving people out of a war zone, right? A really fluid situation, you want to make sure that you have your time zones covered. You want to make sure you have your language skills covered. You also want to make sure that that everybody doesn't have the same set of skills. So I mentioned, some of my friends are pilots and we try not to fault them for it, but like that's a personality archetype and they're incredibly useful. But I would not say like, they're not diplomats, right? Like you need somebody who's good on the phone. You need somebody who is good with data organization. You need somebody who is good with cyber hygiene, right? These are really tactical examples. And why I'm pulling them out is to say what your team looks like is defined by what your problem is, not by what the solution is, right? It's not about, oh, we're building an app. No, it's why are you building the app, right? So Natsec Girl Squad's herd mentality came many years into our existence because we had to really understand the problem set, right? And your problem and your known and probably unknown confounding variables is what dictates what you need on your team and how you should think about diversity, right? So I want to be as specific as possible because I think this is a really important question, but I'd be curious, for those that are listening live or for you, like it really comes down to a specific problem and making sure that you're not creating Swiss cheese, right? You're not just creating the same holes over and over again. So an example that kind of makes me laugh, during the evacuation, I was the only person part of the team who is not in the military, which in some ways was a nightmare for me, but in other ways really useful. And one of the ways it was useful is that as we were moving one of the buses through Liberty Gate, we had a very low level Taliban enforcer, get on the bus and wasn't going to let the bus through. And somebody had to get on the phone with this guy and convince him to leave, him and his friends to leave the bus. And everybody else was in the military and was like, oh, this is a really bad idea. We can't, active duty, we can't do that. So I was like, I might be out on a run with my dog right now, but I can be that girl on video chat, right? And I'm sure it was an experience for them as much as it was for me. But it's a really very obvious example of having people with different, not even skills, but things they're allowed to do can be quite handy. And people seem to like that example.
Yeah, that's a great example. What other organizations do you think are getting it right? And what are they doing and how are they doing it?
What
If
is
any.
it? What do you mean?
Just kind of, in terms of when we talk about institutional readiness, right? And when we talk
yeah. Like who's doing a good job?
Yeah.
Got it. So I think everybody is doing a good job in some way. No one is failing completely. Because at the very least, everybody knows they have a problem. And that's really important. So places that I'm really impressed by, Army TRADOC. Every day I wake up and I'm like, you guys are great. Keep doing what you do. Which is not to say that the US Army of all places is perfect. It's not. But I really think Training and Doctrine Command understands that they are responsible for the whole force in a number of ways. And they are the first to find a way to make it work rather than find a reason why something won't. And that's incredibly admirable. I think I've been heartened by it. This is a hard question for me right now. I think for a lot of us, right after coming off of the last couple of months, I see a lot of individual human institutional readiness, right? What's so interesting to me is that a number of us in this space, we all see what the problems are, the silos, the inefficiencies, all this stuff. And when our structures fail us, we somehow immediately know what to do, right? We immediately know how to spin something up and get it out the door. And there must be a reason for that, right? That is a skill set. And it means that the institutions are training excellent individuals. We just haven't remembered that we're not the only person in the room, right? We're always the main character in our own stories. And so I think everybody is doing a good job on an individual level, right? On the individual Lego components. I can't believe I'm saying this, but there is good everywhere. You just have to squint. But that's kind of something that I've realized and dealt with a lot over the recent months, is just that for some reason across the apparatus, there are people who, when shit hits the fan, they get it done. And no one's surprised by this. So why is that? Right? Why is it that when we're forced to, on an individual level, we know what to do? How do we recreate that every day? So I'm not really answering your question, I apologize, but rather posing another one. I think there's more good than we realize. We just have to figure out, why is it so operational?
I think you did answer the question though. And I think that's a good segue into my next question. And then we'll get to Q&A in a second. But I mean, you have an organization that you had like a Natsec Girl Squad con, you have trainings. I know I've done some of them. I participated and I've led some of the trainings in Natsec Girl Squad. So if you want to talk a little bit about the resources that it offers to be able to get at what you were talking about.
Yeah.
I do feel like there are all of these resources out there, and then we have a CEO of an organization that provides that right in front of us. So it would be
Good
nice.
Point. Okay, fair. Yeah. And to be fair, like, I'm not there every day anymore. And so I don't want to speak out of turn, but broadly what the community focuses on is how do you build expertise, build confidence in that expertise, both by the holder of the expertise and the outside world. And how do you institutionalize it? How do you make it happen again, right? That it's not just a unicorn. And what Natsec Girl Squad has focused on is creating the platform, right? So creating the system, the process, so that trainings can happen. And in the first couple of years, we produced a lot of the trainings. And that was all kind of part of this larger plan of really sort of being like YouTube and making it so that the individual members can just lead the trainings on their own. So actually anyone can sign up to lead a training. It's all on the website and it runs everything. You can have, public speaking 101. There's like, there's, I think, 6 sessions a week of intermediate and advanced Mandarin. We have a great relationship with a company called Lafleur. There's, on average, women spend an awful lot of time trying to figure out what to wear for work if you're not in uniform, because it impacts how people perceive and receive us. And so we have a relationship with Lafleur that looks at, personal style and professional life, and you get matched with a mentor like Corey Shockey while you also figure out what you're wearing to your briefing. It's great. We also do some micro credentialing programs. So we have one on US-Mexico relations. We're actually heading to Mexico City, knock on wood, COVID, as long as COVID stays at bay. We hope in the spring. We have one on kind of public and media relations and national security. How do you tell the story of national security to the regular human beings that live in the world? One on terrorism and counterterrorism studies, that'll start up in this summer, in partnership with the Counterterrorism Center at West Point. And one on organizational operations, right? How do you just run an office? So it's pretty diverse. We also have a relationship with a company called LVEST, which is focused on financial readiness and financial planning for women. We've had, we really have done it all. The joke has always been that our annual conference, it's the largest and longest national security conference in the world, which is wild to me. It's the only place that you can have an interview with the CIA, meet one-on-one with a 4-star, and get a facial all at once. And I'm very proud of that.
I think that's awesome. So if somebody wanted, and I think this is the perfect segue, and then we'll move to Q&A, but I just have to touch on, there are people, and everywhere I go, when I teach classes, and especially when I bring some of the JSOU programs, which are fabulous, to COCOMs or, TSOCs or whatever, people are like, how can I get more of this? How do I get my people to do this? So I'm asking you, like, if somebody is listening, whether through our YouTube channels or through our live Q&A, how do they get their people to do this? This sounds awesome. How do they engage? How do they find you? What are their next steps? Because I think that's a practical, tactical thing that we can offer in this webinar, we can bring to the table.
Yeah. So first thing is that Natsec Girl Squad is the name. It is open to anyone, regardless of gender. There is a pretty clear code of conduct on our website. It's natsecgirlsquad.com. And as long as you're willing to abide by the code of conduct, which very clearly states you can't be an asshole or a foreign agent, if you can commit to those 2 things, you can join as a member. There's a paid membership and a free membership. Free membership, there's the open source listserv, things like that. Herd Mentality, you get access to. It's an app you can download on your phone from the App Store, Android or iPhone, or visit from your computer through a locked portal. And also on our website, it'll take you through kind of like what herd mentality is, how the pre-recorded, live, ongoing courses, how all of that works. There's also a really pretty easy link to sign up for teaching. I'm just looking what's in the chat. Yeah, we do try to, we do set the bar as high as we can, while make sure that we're still diverse, Carrie. But yes, as long as you're not an asshole or a foreign agent, you can sign up to teach or host. There's a link right on the website. Again, it's natsecgirlsquad.com. We try to make it easy, right? Again, like Natsec Girl Squad is not the solution. It is the system to help you figure out the solution, because what works for me isn't going to be what works for you or works for every single person. We do partner with, I think, almost 36 federal agencies. So really everybody from, diplomatic security to TRADOC to FBI, CIA, DIA, you name them, they're probably there. And it's a pretty good time. I mean, it doesn't require much effort to get involved.
That's great. It's a great answer. And I'm reading the chat right now, and I'm going to pivot, and thank you for that. I'm going to pivot to the Q&A session. So there's one question in here, and it's from someone named Gavril, and they're asking, certainly clearances take too long, and I think there's a trade-off for talent and development. Would possible innovations clearances step up further to a civil level, or type at least for education or acquisition purposes from an agency, for example? I have the impression there will be a need for advanced courses for the US Space Force with university students in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good question. Anything is possible, right? So it's just a matter of, does someone do it or not? That's a different problem or different question. My hesitation on slices of the pie like this is that it doesn't tackle the problem, and it creates more chaos, right? So it's like, okay, you have access to this tiny little thing within Space Force, but heaven forbid you be smart, capable, competent, interested human being who might also be useful someplace else, and nope, sorry, can't go to that meeting. I really, really wish we would just fix the problem instead of duct taping more things together. But beggars can't be choosers. And I think we also, I have this conversation with federal law enforcement agencies quite a bit. They believe that after you come out of college or the military, but mostly after you come out of college, you die. You don't exist anymore. You are not to be recruited into any agency. And right, like the entire national security apparatus really relies on early career talent. And if you don't get cleared while you're in college or right out of the gate, goodbye, right? And that's so silly. It's such a waste. So that is a big part of why I hesitate to, again, kind of like chip away at this piece by piece, when one solution, like if you can solve this in the innovation space for the Space Force, you've actually solved it everywhere else. You just aren't applying the solution, because it's not that hard. It just feels hard. And it's like how I feel about writing. Writing's not actually hard for me. It just feels hard. It feels scary. And if I just got over it and sat down and started writing, it'd be fine. We've told ourselves security clearance reform is scary. It's not.
That is a great answer. Sometimes things that are scary aren't at all. So I think that's a great way. Okay, so Carrie has a question, Carrie Roberts from JSOU. How do we recruit Natsec experts who address cultural and regional specific problems, so Mideast, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, et cetera, and meet the ideals of DEI at the same time? Is there a careful balancing act that enhances our search for such subject matter experts?
This is a great question. And not, I really don't think it's that hard. Because it turns out like the world is, a globe is 3D, right? And we were talking about like, what do I think are kind of the threats and challenges? So if we're addressing the threats and challenges adequately, right, we're gonna get a little bit of everything. Meeting the ideals of DEI is such a fabulous way of putting it, because it's not about quotas. Nobody here wants to be somebody's token. No, like things that make me crazy include, but are not limited to, the phrase female Marine, which implies that Marine is a gendered term. And when people tell me what percentage of their office or service or department is like insert demographic, right? I'm like, oh, great, I don't know anything about any of these people at all. I have no idea how diverse this group is because 50% of them are women. Okay, sure. Diversity is not something that is solved, like it's not static, and it's not something that can be fixed simply in the acts of hiring and retaining people, right? Because there is also always a pipeline piece of this, right? How do you ensure that people have access to the education that is required? All of these things, right? And so you've got to define your terms and define success, right? You cannot boil the ocean. I have tried, it's exhausting. So I think if you take the ideals of DEI to be about how do you make sure you have the right people and that you're looking all of the places that you can reasonably look to get the right mix of people, right? Not making individual decisions in a vacuum, but rather looking at the sum of all the parts, then you're doing your job. A lot of it will solve for itself, really, truly.
And I think also looking at the problems too, like you said earlier, is really helpful.
Yeah.
For that. So second question, does herd mentality for anyone on Natsec offer a working solution for tackling skills across the community in a way that can help us create the diverse, competent D&D party to take on complex challenges via a process that isn't founded on dumb luck? Also, thank you so much for this outstanding event to you and JSOU. You're welcome.
So thank you for having me. And yes, so one of the things that I love about herd mentality is that a lot of us that are on there don't use other platforms. So to say that it is a learning tool is accurate, but is not the whole picture. It's sort of like if you took the good parts of Twitter and the good parts of LinkedIn and then added in something like Moodle or Blackboard or whatever and smashed them all together. So each person has their own individual profile and you can interact with one another. Everybody owns their own data. The way we built it is so that the Natsec Girl Squad team, the developers did not build a backdoor. And so they signed all the data over to the Natsec Girl Squad team and we signed it back to the members. So we can't look at anything that you're doing that isn't public. People lock themselves out of their accounts all the time. And I'm like, no, I cannot help you. Thank God. But so you can post on your own. You can send messages on your own, group chat and individual. Please do not abuse the group chat feature. There are different squads. So there's a bunch of us that run. And so there's like there's a squad on there of runners. There's people that post, their dog pictures. And you can also search the whole platform. So while your messages aren't searchable, your posts and your profile are. So if you type in the word innovation, in the search bar, it will pull up for you every time the word innovation is used on the platform, whether in someone's profile or in a post or an event, anything like that. So it has a lot of uses. we've gotten through maybe 10% of the iceberg there, and I'm really excited to watch it kind of continue to grow and flourish. It's 13 months old now. It's one of the things I'm most proud of. I never ever thought I would build an app, right? I have my idea of high tech is index cards. So it's pretty funny that I designed and executed an app. But anything is possible, right, guys? You can teach an old dog new tricks. So the possibilities are endless. And I would definitely encourage people to check it out. I would also encourage them to join a D&D party. I mean, so like, what an excellent use of your time. I'm pretty sure a few members of my D&D group are probably either watching this live or watching on YouTube. So you got your shout out, my friends. But yes, I agree. It would be better if it wasn't just dumb luck, right?
Well, I think this has been an amazing discussion. And also, I just learned that you built an app during a pandemic.
Yeah.
So that is
never doing that again.
It's just a testament to
if
you want something bad enough and you have the drive to do it, then you can just, hire the best people and put the best people in charge. So I think you've really shown that you can do that, even if it's hard. Like, we can do hard things, right?
We can do hard things. Listen, I mean, look, Operation Eagle has no idea what it's doing. And now there's like 318 Afghans in Phoenix, Arizona. That's harder than building an app, and we still did it.
Right.
So
And
we can all do hard things.
I think that, and we don't have time. I wanted to touch on that a little bit because, that was such in the early days of the Afghan evacuation, and I use the term loosely in a lot of ways, but in the early days of the chaos that tried to become the Afghan evacuation, it was, so taxing. And I know that I helped with that effort for, a couple of days.
I'm sure all of us did, right? That's why I bring it up to this group, right? And I know it's something that's on everybody's mind. And I don't want it to be our undoing, right? I want it to be the thing that helps us be better. So try not to hide from it. It's
and I think
easier said than done.
Well, it is, but I think that it's such a testament that we, that good things did come from that. Yes. After I had my part and I helped, I kind of stepped away and let other people help with the resettling effort. But I mean, you're really knee deep in it every single day. And I think it's a good thing. It's hard though. And I think we can do hard things.
We can do hard things. And thank you so much for having me. And I hope everyone learns to play D&D.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much. And once again, this has been an amazing webinar. Thank you, Maggie, for joining us. And I hope to see everyone on the next one. Thanks.